Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to the virtual museum lecture series presented by the St. Catharines Museum and Welland Canal Center. Our community is filled with diverse stories, and we recognize that our story begins with the Indigenous peoples of this land. We acknowledge that we are broadcasting this lecture on lands that have been inhabited by Indigenous peoples for millennia, and we would like to honor the centuries of Indigenous peoples who walked on Turtle Island before us. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Adrian Petrie, Visitor Services Coordinator here at the St. Catharines Museum and Welland Canal Center. Welcome back to the series, and a special welcome to any new members out there who are joining us this evening. Thank you for joining us. We hope these lectures provide a bit of historical joy and spark imagination and exploration into our city's rich history. There are so many ways to join in the historical fun and get your local history fix. You can now view all past lectures on YouTube, on our YouTube channel playlist, seen here. And you can also listen to the lecture audio on our podcast, VMLS Via Podcast, which you can find anywhere you get your podcasts under our banner, STC Museum Podcasts. As always, please feel free to make use of the chat box to ask questions or send comments. We'll moderate them during and at the end of the presentation. There is a slight delay in the broadcast, as always. So if we miss your question or you don't feel like if you feel you've missed your chance, that's okay. We'll get to it at the end of the presentation. Exciting news, you know it's summertime when we are open late in the summer. A bit of a hiatus being open late the last few years, but we're bringing open late back, and so we'll be open late every Tuesday till 8 p.m. between May 24th and October 4th here at the St. Catharines Museum. Gives you a little bit of an extra window to come and see all the wonderful exhibits that we have. We so appreciate you joining the lecture series, and we would equally appreciate a donation in support of our programming. Your donations help us to continue to provide the high quality and enjoyable programming that you've come to expect from us. We really appreciate any donation you're able to make. Give us a call at 905-984-8880 or visit the donation portal on our active STC page to make a donation. The link for the portal was included in the VMLS email today. Your donation makes a difference. Thank you. Before I hand it over to Natasha, I'm very happy to announce the lineup for our upcoming lecture series. And I know that all of you are very excited, waiting with bated breath since I've been teasing it for the last few weeks and weeks. But here we go. This is our autumn 2022 lineup of the virtual museum lecture series. All right, on September 20th, we welcome guest lecturer Carl Dockstader to the series to present a talk titled One Dish, One History. There Were People Here Before 1876. As you may remember, we had to cancel Carl's previous lecture in this series because of some technical difficulties, but we are so pleased that Carl will be able to join us in September. On October 4th, we are very happy to welcome back local historian Rochelle Bush to speak about Niagara's Freedom Trail, the loosely connected network of important heritage sites, museums, and other historical places connected to the story of freedom and the Underground Railroad throughout Niagara. On October 18th, we're very excited to welcome special guest Paul Miller to speak about the history and the future of the Queenston Street neighborhood with a lecture called Queenston, a Working Neighborhood. On November 1st, we're also excited to welcome special guest and historian Dr. Jonathan Vance to discuss his research into corporate memorials with a lecture titled Our Gallant Employees, Corporate Commemoration in Post-War Canada. On November 15th, our curator, Kathleen Powell, will deliver a lecture about the interwar period in St. Catharines titled In the Public Interest, Public Works in St. Catharines Between the World Wars. And I'm told there will be some really interesting photographs to go along with this lecture. On November 29th, special guest, local historian and chair of the city's Heritage Committee, Brian Nari, will return to the series to give a talk about early settlement in St. Catharines. As you may remember from Brian's other lectures, Brian likes a good title. So here's my attempt at his title. By November, I'll be well practiced. But ponderous Fraus, mine hares, and jaded farm horses, or early St. Catherine's before the first Welland Canal. And finally, we're also very happy to welcome back Dr. Kimberly Monk on December 13th to provide a bit of an update and more in-depth history about the history of Niagara shipyards, including the archaeological work that's going on at the Ship Luna shipyard dig. After 2 long years away from the site, Dr. Monk will be back on the dig this summer with her field school through Brock University, and we're very much looking forward to hearing more about the things that she finds this summer, but also more about her research into the awesome and deep history of shipbuilding in St. Catharines and Niagara. And Kimberly Monk gets a pass on the title of her lecture because it's all the way in December. And she promises to have a title by the fall, but it'll be generally something along the lines of Back to the Dig or Back to the Yard or something like that. You'll remember that Dr. Monk has been on the lecture series way back in the spring of 2020. So we're very much looking forward to hearing more about the shipyard with this series. And now I'm very happy to welcome tonight's special guest lecturer, Natasha Henry Dixon. Natasha Henry Dixon is the newly appointed Assistant Professor of African Canadian History at York University. Very exciting. Her PhD research examines the lives and experiences of African people enslaved in colonial Ontario. Natasha is a 2018 Vanier Scholar and is also the president of the Ontario Black History Society. She is an award-winning author and an award-winning curriculum developer focusing on Black Canadian experiences. She has written several books and has also contributed several entries to the Canadian Encyclopedia on African Canadian history. Most recently, Natasha rewrote 2 heritage plaques on the Black history, which I saw recently, congratulations, on Black history in Niagara-on-the-Lake, the 1830s Solomon Mosby Affair, and the Niagara Baptist Church burial ground. Through her various professional, academic, and community roles, Natasha's work is grounded in her commitment to research, to collect, preserve, and disseminate the histories of Black Canadians. And for any of our longtime audience members, you'll remember Natasha from her previous appearance here on the lecture series with her lecture about Ontario's racially segregated schools. Today, she's going to talk about Emancipation Day, and I shall stop talking and hand it over to Natasha. Thank you so much for joining us. Enjoy, everybody.
Thank you so much, Adrian. Thanks for the introduction. And thank you for inviting me to be with you again to talk a little bit about some of Canada, our Black history, Canadian Black history, but specifically as well related or connected to Ontario. So I'm going to talk today about the history of Emancipation Day in Canada, which this year will be commemorated as the 180th anniversary of Emancipation Day commemorations. And through my discussion on Emancipation Day, delve into the roots of Emancipation Day, which really are the combination of unfreedom and freedom related to people of African descent, and the history of the transatlantic slave trade, enslavement, and of course subsequent abolition, which led to the commemoration of August 1st as Emancipation Day. I'd like to begin by just giving a little bit of touching on slavery in Canada, our own history here in what we now call Canada, and the history of that lasted over 200 years of the enslavement of people of African descent and Indigenous people as it relates to colonization by the French and the English. Slavery was first introduced under the French regime in New France, and when the power transitioned to British control, slavery continued. And what resulted was actually a huge shift in demographics of those who were held in bondage. Under New France, it was largely those who were indigenous, who were enslaved, about 2/3. And then 1/3 of those who were enslaved were African people, based on the research by Marcel Trudel. And then under British control, after 1760, the demographic of those who were held in bondage were majority people of African descent, with huge decreasing numbers of those who were indigenous, but still, of course, held, subjugated, and forced to labor. And so during the course of the 1620s, up until August 1st, 1834, slavery was practiced, it was accepted, it was common, it was upheld legally through property law. And it was something that was an important role, an important tool in the colonization of what has we come to now know as Canada. Those who were enslaved were forced to labor. Their labor was exploited, and their work ranged just drastically, from clearing trees and building structures for new settlements, homesteads, and towns and emerging cities, to domestic work. There was a range of work that slave labor was used to build personal wealth, but also the wealth of the colonies at that time. And so, this, as I said, slavery continued for until 1834 with the passage of the legislation, which I will talk about briefly. And it began to gradually be phased out in different jurisdictions. And when you're looking at Canada, slavery was practiced in the maritime provinces, in Quebec, and in Ontario. And at different points in time, slavery began to be phased out in these different jurisdictions. And here in Upper Canada, now Ontario, there was legislation passed in 1793 that introduced gradual abolition. So when I wrote my book on Emancipation Day and started this research, that would have been in 2008, and my book was published in 2010. The primary focus of my research, based on my understanding of Emancipation Day at that time, was primarily focused on, I really saw Emancipation Day as focusing largely in the 19th century, particularly with the increase of freedom seekers coming into Canada after the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act was passed. And so there was a lot of information that pulled together to really lend in that focus. Over the course of that time, since my book was published, and of course something that I continue to research, and now with my doctoral research project focusing on slavery, the lives and experiences of those who were enslaved in this province, I've taken a particular interest in taking a closer look at the lives of people who were enslaved, Black people who were enslaved here in the province, and who transitioned from being held in bondage here in Upper Canada and transitioning to freedom. And taking a look at some of these stories, it really does, for me, complicate the history of Emancipation Day and the meaning of freedom in this context at that time. And just as a couple of examples, there were, at the time the legislation took effect on August 1st, 1834, There was one instance of a young person who was enslaved that really has to me, a strong connection to this. There was a young boy by the name of Tom who in 1824, in the summer of 1824, his remaining 10 years of labor, enslaved labor, was sold in a contract. And in this contract, it noted that Tom had 10 years remaining based on his age. He was born just after 1793, after the gradual abolition legislation was passed. And so, as a child born just after 1793, he could be held enslaved until the age of 25. And so when I look at this bill of sale, this transaction that where Tom was sold from one loyalist to another, his 10 years essentially ended in the summer of 1834. Not much else is known about Tom, and so I don't know if he was alive on August 1st, 1834, but if he was, this legislation would have had a strong impact on his life and his social status. And then the second example, sorry, I should have shown that here. This was a transcription of the bill of sale related to Tom, who was sold from Eli Keeler to William Bell in the Belleville area. And then the second example is the life is a man by the name of Joe Gutchess. He was a man who was enslaved in New York, and in testimony previous, he noted that he was kidnapped and resold into slavery, even though he escaped to serve across the British lines and was supposed to have been awarded his freedom for that service. He was sold to Judge Richard Cartwright in the Kingston area and was enslaved and remained enslaved for quite some time. When Judge Cartwright passed away, Joe Gutchess became the property of Judge Cartwright's son. And it is noted that Joe Gutchess resided with John Cartwright until his passing. Here is a notice of Joseph Gutchess's death at the age of approximately 79 in 1842. And so this is someone who was enslaved in New York, brought into the province. He served, but was still re-enslaved, remained enslaved even though he asked for his freedom. And, perhaps at some point in time, John Cartwright did free him as an older person. But this is someone who had lived, right, in bondage, and then subsequently was able to witness what took place and the impact of August 1st, 1834. And so, in sharing these stories again and to look at the history of Emancipation Day in Canada is something to really unpack through the stories and the experiences of some of the individuals who were held in bondage and those who were able to experience and celebrate freedom here in the North. And so these are just some of the individuals that I continue to research and will be writing more about and sharing their lives as I look at, as I said, those who were enslaved and those who were able to then make that transition into freedom in my project, One Too Many. And so, as I mentioned a few times, the legislation, an act for the abolition of slavery throughout the British colonies, it passed on August 28, 1833, and it became law. It took effect on August 1st, 1834. And this abolished slavery in most British territories. In some places, it was also very complicated because in some of the British colonies in the Caribbean, some people transitioned from they transitioned from technically a status of being enslaved to people who were apprenticed. But They worked under the same conditions and their labor was exploited, again, for the benefit of those who held them in bondage. In some places, immediately on August 1st, 1834, slavery was abolished and those who were enslaved were free. And then here in Canada, this legislation for the British colonies that came to be Canada, and this is more relevant to Upper Canada, that there would have been, a handful of individuals who had remained enslaved at that time and for whom this legislation set free. And so, of course, because of the gravity of this legislation and what it meant, and this day that this legislation took effect, immediately a celebration took form. The very first Emancipation Day celebrations took place on the day that the legislation took effect. In my research, one of the places noted to celebrate on August 1st, 1834 was in Montreal. And then there's, newspaper records of celebration in the Niagara area in 1835. Here is a list of quite a number of places, towns, and cities who have commemorated Emancipation Day since 1834 at different points in time in history. And I'll share a little bit more about that as well. These locations of Emancipation Day commemorations obviously connect to places where there were, strong Black populations or Black neighborhoods. And this was an occasion that was, in marking freedom, was organized by and commemorated by Black people, Black Canadians, and received support from some white allies and sympathizers as well in the marking of this occasion. So what did Emancipation Day commemorations look like throughout its history, its 188 years of commemoration? Emancipation Day events, and from the historical perspective, the day began with church services, early morning church services. And these church services were held at a lot of Black churches, the African Methodist Episcopal churches, as well as British Methodist Episcopal churches. Here is a picture of the Beth Emmanuel BME Church in London, Ontario. Emancipation Day was a huge occasion for Black communities. It was something that was well organized and took a lot of time and energy in order to put together. There was, a main committee. They established subcommittees in order to plan and execute. There were people who were appointed as chairpeople and leaders. And so it was an important occasion, as I said, that took a lot of people to pull off these programs that lasted an entire day, and in some places took place over the course of 2 or 3 days. And so the early morning church services was one of the ways that the occasion started in a lot of these communities, and particularly in the 19th century. And this, looking at the church services, I should say as well, when you look at how these days began, that this shows us how the role and how integral the Black church was to a lot of these communities, and these communities who often were formed as a result of the influx of freedom seekers from the United States. And so this is just another way to illustrate and to show how the role of the church in Black communities. The occasion also involved quite a many speakers, a range of speakers from various walks of life. There were speakers, activists, leaders who would address the audiences who came together to mark Emancipation Day. Some of these speakers included Black abolitionist Henry Bibb, who escaped slavery and actually resided in Windsor for a short time and founded the newspaper, The Voice of the Fugitive in Windsor. He was a known speaker of Emancipation Day events, both in the Windsor area, in this province in Ontario, but also that Emancipation Day events that were taking place in Michigan. Josiah Henson was also a noted speaker, organizer and speaker of Emancipation Day. He was one of the founders of the Don Settlement, where Uncle Tom's Cabin historic site now is on that property. He was a speaker, a leader, and an organizer of Emancipation Day. There's also Josephus O'Banyoun, who was a pastor of the BME Church. He was the founder of the Canadian Jubilee Singers. He played an important role in organizing Emancipation Day and was one of the known speakers as well for events across the province. And then there's B.J. Spencer Pitt, who's a lawyer in Toronto, and he was the president of the Toronto branch of the Universal Negro Improvement Association. And under his leadership, the UNIA was responsible for organizing Emancipation Day commemorations that took place at Port Dalhousie for quite a number of years. In the 1930s, 40s, and then into the early 1950s. Mifflin Gibbs was also, he resided in Victoria, British Columbia for some time, part of the influx of African Americans who relocated to British Columbia. He was a speaker at Emancipation Day events that were planned in that province. And then well-known Frederick Douglass was another speaker as well who attended. There were speakers, speakers from Ontario who would circulate to different events. And then there were also African-American speakers who were invited to speak as well. And so that included Frederick Douglass, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who spoke at Emancipation Day events in Windsor. And then there was Marcus Garvey, Pan-Africanist Marcus Garvey. He co-founded the UNIA with his wife, his first wife, Amy Garvey. And he spoke at Port Dalhousie in 1938 as well. So this is just to give you an idea of some of the speakers. And in some vicinities, in some areas, Emancipation Day events receive support from some white pastors of different churches. So for example, Reverend Henry Grasset, who was the Reverend at St. James, what is now the St. James Cathedral in downtown Toronto, he hosted Emancipation Day events at that church for just over 20 years. And so he was also part of organizing and speaking at Emancipation Day events in Toronto. Something I wanted to highlight here was the involvement of women in Emancipation Day events. Given that Emancipation Day commemorations began in the 19th century, and there were the standing views of Victorian views of women being in the public sphere, the public records don't always document very well the involvement, right, and presence of Black women in Emancipation Day events. But they were there, they played an integral role in the organizing, the planning, the execution of Emancipation Day events, and then eventually, as participating in as well as performers and as speakers as well. This is just an example of, women in Sandwich, which is now part of Windsor, where the women of the Sandwich Baptist Church, they sold dinner tickets as part of Emancipation Day in order to raise money for the erection of an actual church building, which is today one of the oldest Black churches, original Black churches still standing and having a congregation. In 1954, the Emancipation Day events in Windsor had the theme, a focus on women. And here we see a picture of some of the women who were involved, who were in attendance. And at this event, Mary McLeod Bethune in the center, as well as First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, were the guests of honor and speakers at this women-themed Emancipation Day event. And so, I wanted to point that out, that women were there and they were involved and played an important role in Emancipation Day. You going back to the beginning of Emancipation, as you think about in 1834, going into carrying through to the 19th century, the ways that organizers were able to pull this together, and that people traveled by various means in order to attend in the tens and hundreds in many instances to participate in Emancipation Day events. And so we have people taking steamboats, people taking horse and buggy, depending on where they were residing, taking the train, and then eventually cars once cars were introduced. But just to point this out, to say that people traveled in all manner in order to come together and to join in this important occasion. Parades were another important feature of Emancipation Day commemorations, and this was a time where people, participants, Black Canadians took to the public streets and showed themselves. Parades were often led by someone on a horse, often veterans, followed by a number of performers and bands and residents. I wanted to point out here, you will see at the very back that there's a carriage, and you see women dressed in white. And so these women were being ushered on this carriage, just again to highlight the presence of Black women. These parades were, an important part of Emancipation Day events. And while they were often very celebratory, in some instances, these parades were also parades of protest, which I will talk about in a little bit. So this picture is a parade of Emancipation Day gathering in Amherstburg in 1894. And this is quite a well-known image, and actually the image that I've used for the cover of both of my books on Emancipation Day. This is a sketch of a parade that took place in London, Ontario in 1896. And this sketch was published in the newspaper, the London Free Press. This is an image of just one of the many groups participating in the parades, the long parades, the wonderful parades that took place as part of the greatest freedom show on earth in Windsor, where Emancipation Day came to be marked over the course of 3 days. This is a parade that took place in Toronto in the 1950s. And here you can see the Toronto Negro Vanguards who were here carrying the flags and playing music. In the Niagara area, Emancipation Day was marked since the beginning, since the 1830s. And one of the locations that where people gathered to mark was on Clifton Hill. This in the newspaper, the Globe, talks about large groups of people arriving via train at Clifton to mark the occasion, and that they came from Detroit, from Chatham, and there was almost 1,000 people who converged to celebrate. That the parties who arrived, that they were led by a couple of bands to McGill's Grove near the fall, where they marked the day. some of the musical bands that led the parades, and there were many, but just to highlight two: the French Duke's Precision Drill Team, who participated in many Emancipation Day parades in Windsor, Ontario. They came from Michigan. And the Oneida Native Brass Band participated a few times in Emancipation Day events in the Bradford area. Toasts and resolutions were another feature of Emancipation Day events. And so as part of the Emancipation Day program, there was some conducting of regular business, some meetings, discussions around some issues, and there were often resolutions that were raised, that were introduced and voted on, and depending on what some of the circumstances were in the community. Here's an example of the toasts and resolutions that were noted in 1854, the 20th anniversary of the of 1834 of Emancipation Day. And you will note here, 3 chairs for, different levels of government, that there was an acknowledgement of the president of the provincial freemen, likely referring to Marianne Shadd Carey, and that they had resolved that they would celebrate together in Hamilton, Ontario, the following year. And they concluded by recognizing their wives and their sweethearts. Performances and dances were also very important, and something that participants, of course, look forward to as part of the marking of Emancipation Day. There were dance competitions for a large segment of time during the mid to late 1800s. The dance of the cakewalk was something that was very woven into all Emancipation Day events, this competition, which was something that, again, is another, looking at the element of performance culture that was brought into this. Here, I mentioned the Jubilee Singers earlier that were led by Reverend Josephus O'Banyoun. They were a well-known group who performed at many Emancipation Day events, and they actually traveled to perform. They performed in England as well. They were invited to perform. But these are just, one of dozens of many of groups, choirs, singers who came to perform at Emancipation Day events. In the 20th century, Emancipation Day was generally commemorated in a more relaxed atmosphere, and it grew to a more picnic-style commemoration in many locations. So some of the traditional aspects, as I mentioned, the early morning church services, for example, were done away with, and there was more emphasis on having a good time. And so the special weekend became a community family reunion of a sort, so we're a homecoming of sorts, and we see this taking place in many different areas. And part of that was bringing in some leisure activities. Here, for example, baseball became an important part in some Emancipation Day commemorations. In the Windsor area, the amusement park, that whole fair kind of atmosphere was something that was part of Emancipation Day events. So we start to see this shift in many areas. Just couple to mention as examples. In Owen Sound, these are pictures from Owen Sound, where every year family members would come. Some, yes, remained there locally, but people who had moved to other places, either in the province or in the United States, would come, and this would be part of this family gathering, playing different sports activities and cooking and enjoying the time together. And that was also the case as well with the Barton family just at the turn of the 20th century, where the Barton family was a large family in southwestern Ontario. And this is a note in the Brampton newspaper, The Conservator, in 1898, that noted that the Bartons planned to spend the week camping at the local agricultural fair area to commemorate Emancipation Day. So something quite interesting, again, just to show the reach and the different ways that Emancipation Day was marked. Unfortunately, sometimes, even in marking freedom, even in acknowledging the ways that freedom was made available to and made possible to freedom seekers here in Canada, that even in those occasions that unfortunately sometimes Black Canadians experienced racial discrimination in marking the occasion. One of those instances took place at Leamington Park, where a large number of people from the Chatham-Buxton area, from the different churches, from the different churches in the area, attended to Leamington Park as part of an annual church outing, which also involved the marking of Emancipation Day. The police were called and they were asked to leave because it was noted that it was that Black people were not welcomed in the park after a certain time of day. They were allowed to stay for a little bit longer, but then were asked to leave. And then when they returned to Chatham, some of the church leaders took to the media, then the newspaper, to talk about, to raise this issue and to talk about what they experienced and to demand an apology for this mistreatment that they faced. And so even in this way, again, this is just, one of, unfortunately, several examples of the way that Emancipation Day continued to be relevant in pushing for freedom and equality for Black Canadians. And as I mentioned earlier, that in some occasions, in many occasions, the realities of what Black Canadians face in order for them to exercise freedom or to talk about what limited and restricted the freedom that they envisioned was woven into Emancipation Day. And so it was not just about celebrating. And in fact, sometimes there were conversations of whether or not Emancipation Day should be commemorated at all because of all of the racism that many felt that Black Canadians continue to face. One of the, some of the areas that were often as part of the conversation and concerns raised by Black Canadians during discussions for emancipation involved segregated schooling, involved, restricted employment opportunities because of their race. There were just a number of some of these these common ideas as it relates to racial discrimination that were part of that conversation. And in one example, in Chatham, Ontario, at the 1890 Emancipation Day, and if you recall, I talked about resolutions. One of the resolutions that was introduced and passed unanimously at that 1890 Emancipation Day event was that they would actually not celebrate that day, that year. That day it was going to mark a campaign to agitate for the desegregation of schools, the public schools in Chatham. And so their campaign was launched on Emancipation Day. And they took to the street in protest, not in celebration. So these were, again, some of the concerns that were raised that impacted Black life and Black freedom. Here's just an example, for example, Black women, young Black girls who wanted to pursue nursing being barred from attending nursing schools as that became more professionalized. Here is a reproduction of a placard that was carried by Black paraders in Toronto in the 1950s. And you'll see, as I say, Canada needs racial equality too, because oftentimes, and this continues today, conversations around, what is impeding Black life, conversations around civil rights, racial discrimination often tend to look to the state side. And, Emancipation Day participants this year wanted people to know that Canada has its own issues to reckon with as it relates to freedom and civil rights and equality. Over the course of Emancipation Day commemorations, this for me is in looking at the history. It's not just about looking at the day, not just about looking at how the day was organized. It's important to take a look at who these people were, who organized, who celebrated, to look at what some of their conversations were, what their concerns were, what their achievements were as communities. But this also helps to get a better understanding of Black communities over the course of our history throughout the entire year, not just on August 1st. And Emancipation Day, in marking the abolition of slavery, the core issue, the core theme is freedom. And it's important to think through this history of Emancipation Day to see what visions of Black freedom Black people had in Canada, the ways that they defined freedom and how that evolved over time. In 1834, going into until 1865, the end of slavery, the end of chattel slavery was paramount and was a key anchor in the definition of freedom. Over time, it came to mean equal rights, not to be treated as second-class citizens, human rights, civil rights, addressing the ways that racial discrimination impeded their lives and was part of Canadian society. And so, freedom has come to mean, Black freedom has come to mean, yes, there's a core root there, but that it also came to be defined differently at different points in time in our history. And so this is an ongoing organic process and continues to be the way that they were constructing freedom on their own terms, the way that they were practicing freedom, right? Building communities, building infrastructure, institutions, pushing for education, better employment. All of these things were part of the practice of freedom. And through looking at Emancipation Day, we see the ways that there continues to be this struggle. And so this history highlights the ongoing struggle for full freedom and equality in Canada. And that continues through to today. In 2020, there was a convergence of many things. We had the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. And when we look at a lot of the studies that applies a racial lens, we see the disproportionate ways that racialized people, Black people specifically, for example, have been impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. We also saw the social uprising that took place that spring in response to several murders of Black people at the hands of the police. And this very much is part of this movement, this freedom movement that Emancipation Day is part of more widely. Emancipation Day was still marked in August of 2020, even though there were a lot of COVID restrictions and lockdowns at that time. Here are some people who marched in Toronto in marking the occasion, again, because it remains ever relevant, ever important in that context of 2020. Emancipation Day commemorations from its inception through to today, they're an interweaving of faith, thanksgiving, education, family, remembrance, resistance, and community. This is, again, something that over its 188 years of practice is something that is part of many African descended communities, including here in Canada, and something, again, that is very ceremonial and is a cultural, a very rich, dynamic cultural tradition. Last year, due to the efforts of many people over the course of many years, the federal government recognized Emancipation, August 1st, as Emancipation Day nationally. And this was with the unanimous passage of Bill M36. And so this was last year that this took place. And so it is something that is a good step, something that needs to be paired with policies, with investments in helping to address what are some of the root causes that continues to impede full Black freedom in Canada. And so this is, as I said, is a good step, and it should be seen as an opportunity to continue to raise awareness of the over 400-year presence of Black people here in Canada, through learning about, through the marking of this particular occasion. It also points to the need to continue to fully realize Black freedom in this Canadian context and justice. And it's not a policy fix. It's not, it's the first recognition of the federal government, but from the community level, from the grassroots level, as I mentioned, that it has been marked for 188 years. And so I don't want people to lose sight to say, well, oh, because it's all of a sudden there's this federal recognition that this is the first time, that the roots of this commemoration in the community is really where, that importance should continue to reside. And so throughout my research, throughout these books that I've published on Emancipation Day, I try to, through individuals, through communities, through various themes, bring this history into the Canadian context and to illustrate the ways that it's part of its Black Canadian history, but it is Canadian history. And it's a Canadian tradition that I encourage lots of people, all of you, to learn more about. And so I hope my presentation this evening gave you a rich overview of this long history and encouraging you to read more and to participate in more Emancipation Day events. We've continued to see a resurgence, if you will, of a revitalization of Emancipation Day events. I know Niagara has had some over the course of the past few years. In Toronto, the Ontario Black History Society, we continue that, continue to mark Emancipation Day. And so looking forward to seeing this across the country as an opportunity for community and gathering and learning. Thank you.
Thank you, Natasha.
You're welcome.
That was wonderful. Just before I kick you out of sharing your screen, I should note, while you've got your titles up on the screen, that if anybody local needs access to these copies, we have a couple for sale in the gift shop here at the museum. So do drop by and pick up a copy of Natasha's books. They are excellent. Okay, I'm just going to pop back to my slides. Okay, yeah. Before you go and before we have questions, I'm just going to come back here, see if I can. 1 second. Do my little wrap up. Sorry, everybody. Okay, there we go. All right. So while we wait for comments and questions, oh, and there's a bunch of questions. Excellent. If you enjoyed tonight's presentation, of course, please consider making a donation to the museum so that we can continue to provide the high quality programming that you've come to expect from us. We really appreciate any donation that you're able to make. Give us a call at 905-984-8880, or visit the donation portal on your active SDC page to make a donation. Again, the link for that portal was included in the VMLS email today. Your donation makes a difference. We'd also like to remind everyone to please like and follow and subscribe, click, all the things, so that you don't miss anything on Facebook, on Twitter, on YouTube, on WordPress, and all of our podcasts, of course. If you enjoy our content again as well, please share it in your networks to help more of our community join in on our historical adventures. Quick reminder, it's our first Open Late tonight, and Open Late continues all the way till October 4th, 2022. Once again, we look forward to welcoming you all back to the series in the fall. As I mentioned, our newly announced slate of lecturers and fascinating topics. We're very much looking forward to some new historical adventures in the fall as well. Mark your calendars, and we'll see you in the fall, of course. The Virtual Museum Lecture Series is produced by the St. Catharines Museum and Welland Canal Center. And while I wait for a few more comments and questions to come in, I have a couple of questions actually for you, Natasha. I'm really glad that you I'm really glad that you talked about the development, over time of the I guess the intentionality of Emancipation Day, and the evolution is the word, a better word for it, I think. And I'm wondering if you tracked in your research the shift. I know you talked about the shift from sort of religiosity to more community event, but I'm wondering if you were you able to identify in your research when that shift was happening? Was it a generational shift? I'm just thinking too that like the early abolitionist movement was very religious in their language of their publications and speeches and that kind of thing, but then that changed over time and throughout the 20th century. And so I'm just wondering if you tracked that.
Yes. It seems to occur just right at the turn of the 20th century. And so when you can look at, so yes, it's absolutely generational as well. And then when you look at the changes, right, in society that is taking place, it's also impacting Emancipation Day events. When you get into the more leisurely public activities and whatnot, all of that, right, becomes part of Emancipation Day. When Emancipation Day started, even though it was marking the abolition in British colonies, there were places in the United States that marked August 1st as well, in solidarity with people from the Caribbean. Some places called it West India Day, but they also use it as a platform as part of the abolition movement in the United States to push for and agitate for right, the end of slavery in the United States as well. And so at that time, it was part of the abolition movement. Subsequent to 1865, when American slavery was abolished, there was still a strong focus on teaching and learning about the history of slavery that was intricately woven into Emancipation Day events. And so the speakers, and what they focused on and what they spoke to, the programming really helped to hone in on that. And over time, again, then you start to see that shift into what freedom meant. And so, so we see this evolution over time at different stages.
Yeah, and I think that's thank you for going into that in a deeper level. I think the public perception and the nostalgia, I guess, that for Emancipation Day that I've registered in my time here at the museum, and talking about the big picnic, for example, which is our sort of the biggest example of Emancipation Day celebrations in Port Dalhousie's history, is very much based in, these are descendants of freedom seekers who came to St. Catharines. And so there's like a nostalgia that's connected to the Underground Railroad, that this is all part of that kind of that specific community, but that's not at all what you described today.
Well, it is, but it's more complicated. It's more complicated because it is also an embodiment of the African diaspora. And so when you have the movement of people, right,
That's sort of what I meant, was that it's much wider
Yes.
than maybe what people's nostalgia or what their public perception of that event is today. And did you register that in your research as well? Or even just today, like about how Emancipation Day is celebrated today versus 50 years ago versus 188 years ago, that it's not just about the act anymore. It's not just about 1834. It's about the wider Black experience, for example. Yeah.
Yes. And of course, when I opened up with, that the root thing that connects it is the history of slavery, right? The brutal history of slavery. And so Emancipation Day comes out of marking that occasion in British colonies, but it's something, again, that obviously, due to the transatlantic slave trade, bondage and freedom is very much related to, right, rooted a core root in Black experiences in the Atlantic world. And so you'd see people in different spaces taking it up in many different ways. And in the Canadian context, looking at the different groups of those who comprise that demographic of Black Canadians also brought different things to Emancipation Day as well. And Emancipation Day reflects that.
Absolutely. That's great. Thank you for explaining that so well. A super boring question now. What was the historiography like throughout your research? I know you've been researching this topic forever. Like, what were the gaps and who was writing about this, and what was the secondary material like?
Yes, so there was a book by Professor Kerr Ritchie, and he talked about Emancipation Day in British colonies, and he included some research on Canada. There have been, for a long period of time, pieces written, research done on Emancipation Day. It could be, for example, on Owen Sound. It could be on, Port Dalhousie, but something that pulled all of that together, plus adding more research. There was that didn't exist. And so when I published the book, it was at the invitation of the publishers of then Natural Heritage Books, which is now part of Dundurn Press, part of Dundurn Press. And based on what they observed and their participation in Emancipation Day events in Owen Sound, they knew that this is something as part of Black Canadian history that needed to be pulled together in one text. And so I was able to pull together these two books, but even now I'm still finding more. I can still continue to find stuff on Emancipation Day. People share things on that. And so there's been a lot of work. I think my book kind of helps to pull that together. I've added new research and, want people to continue to build out from there because there's just so much.
That's right. Yes, a lot of history might be specifically related to the location in which we're talking about. For example, we often only tell the Port Dalhousie story rather than, even just mentioning, and it was celebrated, like Emancipation Day has been celebrated in all these other communities too. So that's awesome. I'm so glad. Thank you so much. Lots of great comments in the chat box. As always, thank you again, Natasha, so much for joining us for the lecture.
My pleasure.
Indeed closing our spring series. Thanks very much, everybody, for tuning in, and we'll see you in the fall. Have a great summer, everybody.
Great leading, and mark Emancipation Day on August 1st.
Don't forget Emancipation Day on August 1st.
Have a great evening.
Thanks, everybody. Bye now. Thanks, Natasha.
Thanks, Adrian. Take care.
You too. Bye.